We go. Okay, welcome. Good morning. My name is Jen Park. I'm the Community Engagement and Talent Development Specialist for the Ramapo Catskill Library System. We are so thrilled to welcome Dennis Riley here with us today to present on records management 101 essentially. But if you have any questions specific to your situation, your library, he's happy to take those at the end. You can also place your questions in the chat. If you experience any technical difficulties today due to the weather, feel free to leave the session and come back. If you are in need of a certificate for continuing education or to state that you are in attendance for today's program, you can send that along to me in an email. I'll be placing my email in the chat. But for those who may not have access to the chat, it is Jen, Jen, at rcls.org. So this session is slated to last until about 11:30. If you need to leave early, please go ahead and do so. Any questions, any follow-up questions, I'm sure Dennis will be providing his information during the presentation, but you can always reach out to me and I will connect you to him. So at this time, I do want to welcome Dennis. Dennis Riley is a regional advisor at the New York State Archives, providing records management and archive services throughout the Hudson Valley-Catskill region. Prior to this, he was an appraisal archivist at the State Archives, working with agencies to identify and transfer records of enduring historical value. For this, he managed both corporate records and historical collections at the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation and worked at the National Archives at New York City as part of its reference services staff, where among other projects, he focused on promoting holdings related to Puerto Rico. So needless to say, we have quite the expert in our midst today. So with that, I'm going to thank Dennis for being here and turn it over to him. And if you need me at all during today's session, anyone, I am here and I'm ready to assist. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, for that introduction. And let me just add my welcome to everyone for joining today. It is always a privilege and exciting opportunity to reach new audiences. So thanks, Jen, for setting this up, and thanks everyone for attending. Let me just share my screen so I can get my presentation up. Slideshow. Oh, you know what? I just need to do one thing because I just realized. Oh, I apologize for this little technical difficulties. I had to switch to a different laptop, and my notes are on the other one. So let me just start this slideshow from the beginning. And okay, sorry for that little technical glitch. Let me close that. So today I'm going to talk about records management, some basics, and a focus on retention and disposition specifically. This is the roadmap that I've laid out. I'm going to start with, again, some basics of records management, the elements of an effective program, some concepts in terms of roles and responsibilities, and some things you want to think about when it comes to policies and procedures. I'll then dive in to a little bit more detail about the specifics of retention and disposition. A lot of what I'm talking about today, we have separate full workshops on, so I will, in some respects, only be touching on the highlights, but if you want me to go into greater detail, again, feel free to put that in the chat and I will try to address any of your questions. Because I think this is a great opportunity to emphasize good or best practices when it comes to records management and what it can really mean to your organization. I'll then give a brief introduction to the new retention schedule if you haven't heard. there is a new retention schedule for local governments, and I'll highlight a few of the items that have changed specific to libraries. Spoiler alert, there are only 4 that are specific to public libraries, but I will highlight them. And then at the end, I'll sort of bookend my presentation with some reasons why records management is important. It's a little bit of advocacy, and hopefully give you some ideas as to how to sort of promote your records management program in your institution. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, I do want to acknowledge that here in New York State, we don't like to make things simple or straightforward. I know there are, and public libraries are no different. How you are established, how you function, how you operate is varied, as I understand it. And the state archives only has responsibility or authority if your library is considered a local government entity or part of a local government. Now, I rely on my colleagues at the state library to help me understand what that actually means. And as I understand it, association libraries fall outside that construct. Now, what I'm presenting today, I think, is applicable to any organization. Records management is not just limited to government. It can be your friend regardless of the type of organization you exist in. My hope is to only spend about 45 minutes and then leave the bulk of the session for your questions. And so hopefully if you were expecting something different, I'll try to adapt and address your needs the best I can. So let's talk about records management. Let's get everyone excited on this Friday, despite the weather, the day before Halloween. Let's talk about some good news. If you've never stopped to consider records management, this is a very simplistic overview of what happens to a record over the course of its life. And perhaps it's self-evident, but we create and we receive records in the course of our normal day-to-day operations. We use and disseminate them. And over the course of that business process, we are maintaining and, if necessary, protecting them if there are confidentiality issues and the like. But at a certain point, the immediate business need, that primary purpose for which a record is created and used, will be met. And that's where retention comes in. There are instances, in fact, many types of records that we need to retain longer than that primary business need because of legal or fiscal or other administrative equities that we need to account for. And that's where, when I talk about retention and disposition, the retention schedule sets out that minimum time period. But once that inactive phase ends, we can either destroy and dispose of records, and that's going to be most of what we deal with. But there will be that small quantity of records that have permanent value, enduring value, whether that's historic value or some other ongoing value in terms of like board minutes that sort of document the governance of an organization. And Jen, you referenced my years of experience, and over the years, I have encountered a fair number of reasons why records aren't managed. And these are just 4 of them. There are plenty of others that I hear, but I'd like to take the opportunity to present some counterpoints, some counter arguments as to why I think these perceptions are wrong, or at the very least misguided. The first is records management doesn't need to happen. The risks are low. If we let records hang out, not a problem. Well, I'm here today to say there are inherent risks in that approach. Left unchecked and unmanaged, your records will create headaches. They will result in significant costs. And that's true whether we're talking about paper or electronic. It's just some inherent risks, and I'll be touching on these throughout today's presentation. Second, there's this concept that it adds to our workload. We don't have time, we don't have staff to manage our records. And I have a lot of choice words about that, but I'll just say for today, utter nonsense. as an employee of an organization, particularly as a public employee, but I think this applies to regardless of whether I'm working for the government or a private entity. Managing the records that document my official functions, my decisions, my activities is part of what we sign up for. It helps the organization, and it's something that I need to internalize. It's something that I do, whether I know that I'm doing it or not. And that's where I would argue records management is not one more thing. Whether we manage records efficiently and effectively really determines whether it's a burden or not. And the goal is to implement systems and processes where records management becomes instinctual or part of day-to-day operations, so it isn't one more thing, it isn't a burden. The third perception I've encountered is that sometimes records are not seen as records. What does that mean? Well, again, there's a definition in the law that's kind of long and very legalistic, but in short, a record is anything that documents my official functions, my activities, programs, decisions, or policies that document my official business functions. So if the material provides evidence and information as to my job activities, I'm likely dealing with a record. And finally, the fourth attitude that I've encountered is records management is hard. Well, yes and no. It does take time, it does take thought, it does take resources, but not managing your records isn't going to make the problem go away. It is more advantageous to take small steps in the right direction than to do nothing at all. And I would also say, thinking about records management before records are created goes a long way to solving or avoiding those pitfalls and those burdens. So if you're going to implement a new system, a new database, a new workflow, a new process, thinking about the records management implications ahead of time is really a good strategy. I've been at many a table with lots of smart, dedicated, committed colleagues where we're talking about a system or a workflow that has been in place for years. And I start talking about, well, records management, and the light bulb goes off that we as an organization haven't considered that, and sort of retrofitting records management into an existing system is just more challenging than doing it up front. We have a publication, and I can put the links to the various publications I reference in the chat towards the end. But we have a publication, it's called The 7 Attributes of an Effective Records Management Program. It's actually currently being updated, but these are the 7 bullet points that we think
this isn't our machine, it's from
that we think are what you should be focusing on. The first is that your activities are only creating the records your organization needs. You're not creating superfluous records, and that you're getting rid of them as soon as you can. So you're not maintaining records that no longer serve a purpose. This also implies that you're storing your records, whether paper or electronic, safely and securely, that you're providing safeguards to their integrity, and if they do have confidentiality or sensitivity issues, that you are safeguarding them appropriately. And it also implies that your storage solutions and your approaches to storage and access are efficient and effective. Again, you will be hearing me use that phrase, efficient and effective, over and over again today. Because if you're not able to retrieve your information and your records effectively, that's a good indication to me that there's a problem, or at least room for improvement. You also want to make sure that you're using technology for the right reasons. I've been in plenty of situations where, particularly, not to throw management under the bus, but managers want to throw technology at a perceived problem without necessarily thinking it through. Technology can be our friend, particularly when it comes to records management, but we want to make sure that you're identifying the problems first and making sure the identified solutions actually solve your problems and not simply making trade-offs, because there are some times when technology comes with a trade-off, whether it's a cost or some other requirement. The sixth one is I think a little harder for some folks to achieve or wrap their head around, and that's sort of promoting the use and usability of those permanent records, and whether that's for external, what we normally think of historical research, archival research, or internal institutional memory. Those permanent records are not there just to be warehoused and sit on shelves. We identify them because they have enduring value and they should be used. Again, whether that's internal or external. And finally, an effective records management program incorporates records management in all its day-to-day operations and recognizes that it is everyone's job. It is not just one person or a couple people. We really have to think of records management as a team effort. Which brings me to roles and responsibilities. Now, I could probably break this down even further. I could talk about information technology or legal staff having a seat at the table, but these are the three categories I'd like to focus on today. First, the records management officer, the RMO. Usually a single individual is identified as having primary responsibility or at least oversight of the records management program. If you are a local government entity, by law, you have to appoint someone as a records management officer, and it's extremely useful to let the state archives know who that is, because they tend to be our primary point of contact. And the RMO is not there to do everything. I don't think I've ever encountered an organization small enough that one person can do everything about, or that is involved with records management. Their role is really to be the overall coordinator and promoter and sort of cheerleader for records management. If your organization is large enough, setting up a system of records liaisons in different offices or departments is very helpful. That way the records management officer has their internal points of contact in order when it comes to promoting and making people aware of what the roles and responsibilities are. It might also be a situation where the RMO, it's important, I think, to have the RMO placed in an organization where they can be listened to and heard and have some chance of being effective. So some organizations will identify someone high up in the organization to be the official RMO, but in terms of day-to-day responsibility, they may delegate that to a more administrative level staff member. And that's, again, we can talk about what works best for your particular circumstances. But it's important to have that executive buy-in and to have that executive support, and that's where a chief executive or governing board is really critical. Leadership starts at the top, and the attitude and the position of a chief executive or a governing board when it comes to records management will really tell everyone else whether or not records are a priority and whether or not I, as a staff member, really need to take it seriously. And again, I've worked in both types of environments where I've had incredible senior leadership support, and it has been amazing and invigorating, and to sort of see everything work towards this ideal. And I've been in other institutions where, suffice it to say, you know, senior leadership, their focus has been elsewhere. And an RMO can only do so much when they don't have that executive buy-in, because they won't necessarily have the adequate resources, or again, staff will get the message, whether it's explicit or implicit, that records aren't the priority. And that's where all staff kind of comes in this last category. They're the ones that are creating and maintaining the records. They should be involved in the disposal of records. And that is with an eye towards none of us are going to be around forever. Whether I leave for another position or eventually retire in 20 years, the idea is that whoever comes after me should be able to step into my shoes and understand what I was doing and what the records were for and how the functions of the organization unfolded, so that we're not reinventing the wheel or coming in as a new staff member and being completely lost as to how the organization works or where my part in that actually fits. And that's where supporting the records management officer comes into play. Again, I kind of emphasize this notion of a team effort. I've seen a fair number of organizations where it's not a team effort. People are going in different directions at the same time, and it limits the ability to create an effective records management program. And it leads to this perception that records management is a burden and it's difficult and it's hard. And for me, it's not that records management is hard, it's that organizational culture isn't necessarily supporting the efficiency and effectiveness of records management. And that's where policies and procedures are critical. And it's important to have them written down. If policies and procedures aren't written, to my mind, there's some sort of weird oral tradition that may or may not get passed down, like that the telephone game where we start with a simple sentence and it goes around, and at the end you're completely garbled and confused as to what the original intent was. So having it written down is essential. The policy, just briefly, is broad in nature. It's the what. It's what do we want to achieve. It's the objective. And the procedure is more specific in scope. It's how we're going to achieve that outcome. And you can have a broad overarching records management policy and then more specific procedural documents to focus on, say, retention and disposition or management of inactive records, or what are your policies for email or electronic records. Or you can have one large, standard operating procedure booklet. The form, to my mind, is less important than the fact that you actually cover your basics. What are the essentials of good records management? And that you also address any circumstances that are unique to your specific organization. And I can help you with that. You don't have to come up with these on your own. We do have some templates that people have used in the past that you can adapt. And again, it's where my role as a regional advisor comes into play. And I'll just sort of hone in on this some more as to why policies and procedures are so important. It ensures the consistency. Again, it ensures that staff understand what is expected of them. If there's ever any question of why do we do something a certain way or how have we done it in the past, everyone can sort of look back and be on the same page. We're playing with the same set of rules. Policies and procedures are also a great training tool. Whether that's an annual sort of records management reminder. I worked in one place where we actually sent out an administrative notice once a year saying, here are your records management responsibilities. If you have any questions, here's your point of contact. They can also be a great tool for onboarding of new staff. When a new person comes on board, what is this new environment? What's expected of me? And I will admit this, I don't think I have ever worked anywhere where as a new employee, anyone has ever talked to me about my records management responsibilities. I like to think that's because I work in records management and archives, and that's sort of implied that I know what I'm doing. But if I'm brutally honest, I think it's because no new employees have that opportunity to understand what's expected. And I think it's unfair if we want to have a good, efficient records management program, it's unfair to expect staff to know what is expected of them if we don't put it in writing. So it clears up any confusion, any uncertainty. It raises awareness. It also helps protect you from a legal standpoint if you ever have to demonstrate or why you made certain decisions in terms of your records, whether that's to the public or to the courts. You can sort of point to established policies and procedures as a rational justification that you're not simply making decisions out of thin air. And as I have sort of touched on already, it ensures the longevity of your records management program. I have witnessed a few really good records management programs suffer from staffing changes. You know, again, a new person comes on board, there's nothing written down. What am I supposed to do? I don't know what all these boxes are. And that organization and that system sort of erodes. And it may not happen overnight, but it will happen over time, and policies and procedures ensures that longevity. So let's get into retention and disposition, because in some respects, it's not the only thing you need to worry about when it comes to records management. But when I think about, again, the effectiveness and efficiency and the benefits to your organization, retention and disposition are at the heart of it. I gave you sort of the abbreviated legal definition of a record at the beginning, but here are some concrete questions you can ask yourself as to whether or not you have a record that needs to be managed. Was it part of your official business? Was it received for specific action? Does it otherwise document your activities and decisions? Is it mandated by regulation or by a specific law? Does it support your financial obligations and legal claims? And does it otherwise communicate requirements of your organization? If you answer yes to any of these, you likely have a record. But what about non-records? Well, here are some questions you can ask yourself that might lead you to conclude you don't have a record that doesn't need to be managed. And these generally are reference or convenience materials, whether it's a catalog or a journal, duplicate copies, such as, you know, there's an administrative notice that goes out to 25 employees. Those 25 copies are duplicate copies that don't need to be retained. Draft and working papers can be a little bit of a slippery slope. For the most part, draft and working papers will be considered non-records. I'm drafting my notes for this presentation. As I make changes, I don't need to retain or manage all those, versions or iterations. The only time you might need to stop and pause with draft or working papers is if there is some sort of decision, or particularly an executive involvement, that draft or working paper is involved in. And of course, we have personal papers. I realize in this day and age, we have complex lives, both personal and professional, with email and other forms of communication, cell phones and texting. That line tends to blur. I can only encourage you to keep your personal life and your professional life separate. I have encountered all sorts of sensitive, uncomfortable personal information in people's official business files over the years. If it relates only to your own affairs, it's a personal record. You don't have to manage it. If you sort of mix your personal and professional communications, then it becomes a little bit more sticky. So how do you know what to do and what you do need to keep? Well, the State Archives, I hope, helps you in this by developing what we call the retention schedule. And I think of it as perhaps the primary tool when it comes to records management. And we develop it in conjunction with state oversight agencies as well as local governments. We're not sort of developing this in a vacuum. We're not sitting in Albany trying to figure out how can we make local government's lives more complex. And it lists the minimum time period which records need to be retained before they can be legally disposed. It is media neutral, so it applies to both paper and electronic records, or even records in microfilm. I suppose it could also include stone tablets. But basically, it affects all records. And I do get the question about electronic versus paper records probably at least once a week. It is a very, or at least seemingly simple question with a set of complex answers. Suffice it to say that there is no requirement to maintain paper records if you have an electronic version. However, there are significant considerations you need to take into account because of the nature of electronic records. They do offer some benefits and flexibility, but they also represent a significant commitment on your part towards future information technology and a commitment to your records management responsibilities. And I'm happy to talk about that more either today or on a one-to-one basis, because your circumstances will really dictate what is an acceptable or best approach. The schedule also does not mandate destruction. Again, it only lists the minimum time period you need to retain records, but there are some very good reasons why you should be consistent in destroying records, which I will touch on. There are some instances such as legal proceedings or audits where destruction needs to be suspended. It also doesn't mandate creation of records. Just because a record series is listed in the schedule does not mean you need to create it. And in fact, I would hazard to guess that a vast majority of retention items in the schedule will not apply to libraries. And again, it also only applies to that official copy of record. Keep in mind, duplicates are just that. And finally, it doesn't address all records management issues. Retention and disposition are really important, but just know that there are other factors that sort of feed into that effective records management program that I outlined. So why should you use the schedule? Again, sort of harping on this theme of efficiency and effectiveness. If you're only keeping the records as long as you're required, you will save money and save time and space. And it's a fallacy to think that electronic records don't take up space and don't cost money. The variables and the issues are different, but left unchecked and unmanaged, over time, electronic records will wind up costing quite a bit of money and could cause quite a significant headache. It also helps you identify those records that have permanent ongoing value. And statistics vary, but we like to say only about 3 to 5% of records are ever deemed permanent, which means 95% of your records have a defined lifespan. If you're only keeping what you need to keep, you can devote your finite resources to just those records. And it also helps safeguard your legal and fiscal interests. Again, if you need to produce records or otherwise demonstrate or protect your equities, having an efficient records management program and implementing disposition and retention on a regular basis will facilitate that. Again, over the long run, it will make your life easier, even though where you may be today, it seems overwhelming and a burden. Again, the idea is to develop systems and workflows where it is just seamless. So how do you actually implement disposition? I've already talked a little bit about policies and procedures, so I won't go on anymore with that. Just know that having a defined procedure in place will make sure everyone understands how it unfolds and what their part in the process is. And you want to start by identifying the record series and determining whether you're dealing with the official copy. And a record series is a set of records that are filed together or are used in the same function or activity, such as accounts payable or purchasing files. And you want to focus on one series at a time. Hopefully you're not dealing with situations where you have a jumble of records that might be subject to different retention periods. That really does become a burden. So if you're dealing with just one series at a time, it's important to do that because that's how the retention schedule is organized. It's organized by functional sections. So if you're dealing with banking records, you would look in the fiscal section, because banking is a fiscal function. If you're dealing with equipment, you would look in the public property section, because from our standpoint, equipment owned and operated by a local government is considered public property. Now keep in mind, the retention schedule is developed to be used by every type of local government across New York State. So our series descriptions may be broad, or they may not use the specific terminology you use. So I always think it's a good strategy to think of what is the function of the records and make the best match to the retention series listed in the schedule. And again, it's also important to determine the official copy, because if personnel and finance both have copies of payroll records, you only need to keep one copy. And you kind of just have to decide who's going to be the official holder. And that's, again, where policies and procedures can clarify that. It is really important to be consistent in your disposition activities, and that's where your efficiency and effectiveness really comes in. Because it's ensuring that you're only keeping what you need to keep, you're promptly disposing of records and freeing up staff time and space to really just deal with the records you have to. It also helps reduce the recovery costs should you encounter a disaster, a flood, a burst water pipe, God forbid a fire. The less records you have on hand, the less you have to recover. And again, it also helps identify those records of permanent value. Documenting disposition is also critical. Now, the State Archives does not mandate you do this, but it is in your best interest to document when you dispose of records. And we have a main publication on retention and disposition. There's a sample form in there that you can adapt for your own needs. But you want to make sure your procedures account for this type of documentation, because it is useful in demonstrating that you are consistent and that you are disposing of records in accordance with the schedule, that you are not acting in an arbitrary or capricious manner. Now, courts are generally unfavorable to entities, particularly local governments or governments in general, that don't manage their records well or fail to be consistent in their disposition activities. Courts are more likely to reach an adverse inference than to be sympathetic if our disposition activities are erratic or not well documented. And one strategy to achieve this is that I've been part of and I've seen elsewhere work really effectively is to have an annual or even a more frequent records management day where all staff are encouraged or even required to engage in disposition activities. And I've seen it work in a really fun team building exercise way. So it doesn't have to be a burden. It can really be a way to get the organization all on the same page. And we have a whole other workshop on legal aspects of records management. Now, if at any time you have questions, you need a sounding board to evaluate your options, you want more training, contact me. I'm your point of contact. It's my job You can contact me 10, 20 times a day. If you're not asking me the questions, someone else is. You might as well be at the front of the line. I'm not here to report anyone or pass judgment. I take the advisory part of my title very seriously. I'm not here to tell you what to do. My job is to help you make the best decisions that fit your circumstances. Everyone's going to be a little bit different, whether it's resource constraints or staff or space. So while there are best practices, I understand there are practical, pragmatic realities that we all exist in. But one of the things I highly encourage folks to do, and maybe this is a great follow-up activity we can work together on either individually or collectively, we highly encourage folks to develop what we call office retention schedules. These are more concise than the full 411-page local government retention schedule. And at the end of the day, you know your records better than anyone else. You know what record series you're dealing with. So rather than having staff try to navigate this unwieldy behemoth, most of which probably doesn't relate to you, you can create your own document or spreadsheet that identifies just the records you need to manage. And you can do so by referring to them by the language or the terminology you use. It's also a great place where if you want to deviate from the minimum retention period, such as you want to retain some records longer, you can document that there. Or if you want to designate certain series to be managed electronically, you can, again, use the office retention schedule to do that. The idea is to make retention and disposition easier for staff, so that it does become part of their day-to-day operations. And again, our main publication on retention and disposition goes into this in more detail and has some examples of what these might look like. I have really brief introduction to the new retention schedule. If you haven't heard about it, you're hearing about it now. Back on August 1st, we issued an updated local government retention schedule. It's the first one in over a decade. We have combined the four previous schedules into one. This has eliminated duplication and inconsistencies that have cropped up over the years. And the hope is that it will allow us at the State Archives to update it on a more frequent basis. Our goal is to do it every 5 years. I think rather than every, I think we were up to about 15 or 16 years in some instances. So there is no, if you were using the MU1 or the MI1, those are being phased out. You have the LGS1. The functional sections have remained largely the same. We've now called the general section general administrative. Hopefully that's obvious. There will be some sections specific to school districts and counties you can ignore. All the item numbers have changed as a result of this consolidation. So if you had some favorite numbers that you memorized, you'll have to learn some new ones. But we have included what I think is a easy cross-reference to the old and new numbers within the schedule. We have flagged just the major revisions. We have a summary document on our website that, well, it summarizes the major revisions. It's about 16 pages long. You can check it out and just verify that most of these don't affect you. And major revisions are ones that where the retention period has changed, any new items or sub-items, or any rewording that is substantive and related to the retention. Minor revisions are just those that involve punctuation, spelling, updating references, or any clarification that doesn't affect retention. Most importantly, local governments need to adopt this by a formal resolution of their board by January 1st. After December 31st, authority to use the previous schedules ends. So if you want to legally dispose of records after January 1st, you have to adopt the schedule. And we have a model resolution on our website, which you can use, you can adapt. You just need to adopt something that formally adopts this schedule. You don't have to let the state archives know that you've done it. You just kind of need to do it. And with that, I don't know how am I doing on time? I guess let me kind of go through my presentation, and then I was going to do a little demo on this web search feature of the new schedule. It's a simple keyword search box that will bring up any items with your term or phrase in it. It will also link to the functional section of the schedule, so that if your search results aren't a quite good fit for what you're dealing with, you can browse that section to see if there's a better fit. And again, I'm happy to do a live demonstration of that towards the end. I'm looking at the time, and I kind of want to get through the content and make sure that I'm hitting and answering your questions before I get bogged down in that. So these are the 4 changes that are specific to libraries, and they are really meant to, we kind of realized that we didn't cover all the records you might be dealing with. So we added a few new items to cover interlibrary loan records, library card applications, and records related to programs or exhibits, including any parental consent forms or any sort of enrollment or registration forms. If you actually have those types of records. Again, this is not that you have to create these records, but if you do create them, we wanted to give you guidance as to how long you needed to retain them, because that's perhaps the important thing. If you do have a set of records that are not adequately covered in the schedule, we have to come up with a new item, and you can't destroy records until we do that. So it happens, it's rare, but hopefully these specific changes, again, will help you function a little bit more effectively. There might be some other more general administrative changes that affect you, but in reviewing the changes for the purposes of this presentation, most of the fiscal items and most of the human resources personnel items, those haven't changed. And again, I'm happy to have that conversation with you today or in subsequent encounters as to what may have changed that actually affects your operations. But from my sort of novice perspective, I didn't see anything that really stood out as an area of concern. And so I'm sort of in conclusion, sort of long-winded conclusion, I want to go over some of my top 10 reasons for records management. And this is my little opportunity to sort of repetition as a form of education and learning, sort of beat the drum as to why records management is important and what it can represent for your organization. Now, despite decades of electronic records, the growth of paper still continues unabated in some respects. The growth of electronic records is off the hook. I think everyone's struggling with that to one degree or another. And good records management will help stabilize that, so you're not creating records that are unnecessary and that you are disposing of records in a prompt, efficient, consistent way. And as a result, you will reduce operating costs. Again, record keeping costs administrative dollars, whether that's for equipment or staff time to manage them. The less you have, the less it will cost. And as a result, you will improve efficiency and productivity. Time spent retrieving records or searching for records is wasted time. I don't know about you, but I have worked in, well, any number of organizations, including my current one, where we sit around going, we know we had this, where did we put it? What file name did we save it as? What folder did we save it in? This is a common problem that I've seen in all sorts of organizations. And if you encounter this, records management can help improve it so that you're not wasting time getting your hands on the information that you need. And that might mean assimilating new technologies. As I've touched on a little bit, technology can be our friend, but if it is simply layered on top of a problematic program, you may just be masking the problems, or you might not actually be solving the problems. I've had a number of executives come to me and say, let's scan everything. And I have to, because in their mind, that'll solve the problem of paper. And then I have to have that conversation of, well, what do you actually hope to achieve? And are we prepared to take on the trade-offs, the resultant burdens that come with then managing electronic records? So again, technologies can solve some problems, but we want to understand the problems before we simply adopt new systems. In terms of regulatory compliance, we live in the United States. It is one of the most heavily regulated countries in the world, and within that, we live in New York State. If I have to say more on that, hopefully we all understand the legal and regulatory landscape we operate in. Failure to comply with laws and regulations can lead to fines, penalties, and other legal sanctions. So your records management program can ensure compliance and minimize those litigation risks. It will also help you safeguard information that is vital to your operations. I think of this as sort of continuity of operations. All organizations have records and information that are essential, that need to be protected. Their integrity needs to be assured. And your records management program will help you do that. I like to think of records and information as a positive asset. Often it's seen as a drain on resources, but if we start thinking about records as an asset, as a force multiplier to help us do our jobs better, it can be really invigorating. And I know I'm biased in that respect, but I've worked for organizations where records management and information are part of that information flow all up and down the organizational chain of command, so that decisions at any level of the organization, whether it's by management or sort of rank and file staff, are the best that they can be. If you can put your hands on information when you need it, when you need to make a decision, you will have the comfort and the reassurance that you are making the best decisions. And that's where preserving institutional memory comes in, whether it's for the internal decision-making of our, again, our leadership or our staff, or whether it's, you know, for that outside audience, whether it's historical researchers or the public. I like to think that whatever organization I work for, we do our job for a reason. And in terms of public libraries, you probably know this better than anyone else, how you serve your communities and what that means to people without them even knowing it. So having those records to demonstrate what you have contributed to your communities over the years helps instill a sense of professionalism, whether it's internal for staff or external for that public image. And it's hard to quantify the costs and the benefits of that sense of professionalism. But when staff are working within an inefficient system, you have storerooms of paper records or a messy land system of electronic records, it has a downward drag on morale. And I've worked in situations where people are frustrated because they feel burdened by records. Records management can alleviate that sense and really instill this sense of pride of what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it is important. And along with that is that sense of public image. If we are not able to provide services and programs efficiently and effectively, we contribute to that notion of public institutions being creaky and inefficient and a waste of taxpayer money. And if we're able to provide services efficiently and effectively and seamlessly, it contributes to that notion that we are good value. So, and records management, I really think is at the heart of that, because again, at the heart of everything we do, whether it's a program or a decision or some activity, there are records at the heart of it. And if we get to the place, and it's perhaps an idealistic sort of high on the mountaintop vision or goal, it can really be your friend. And so with that, some final thoughts. Set goals. I think of records management as evolutionary, not revolutionary. You know, have goals for the next 3 months, next 6 months, next 12 months. What are your pain points and what are your options to make things better? Doing nothing is not a winning strategy. Again, if you have, if records management fills you with the sense of being overwhelmed or a burden, let's have that conversation as to how we can change that. If staff are operating within an inefficient system, I think, you know, the time and effort and resources that it takes to operate inefficiently can be better used towards fixing the problem. And you don't have to do it all at once. In fact, I would argue trying to reform records management all at once is a surefire strategy for failure. So taking those incremental steps and moving in, you know, a positive direction is always, you know, it may be slow to see the benefits, but it will ensure a stronger foundation and a stronger program over the long term. And again, know that you're not alone. Contact me anytime. Under so-called normal circumstances, I would be happy to come meet you in person. But these days, Zoom and other forms of connections are what we have. And with that, I am happy to answer your questions. Let me stop sharing my screen so I can go back to Zoom and let me pull up the chat because I do want to give you, that is the link to the publication on retention and disposition. And let me see, I can bring up, I think I said the effectiveness of the 7 attributes. Let me find that. But again, I'm happy to start fielding questions if there are any.
Thank you, Dennis. And for the attendees, I will be pulling these links and will place them in my follow-up email to everyone, which you'll receive probably Monday. So don't worry, I will be capturing all of this information. So Dennis, I just want to let you know there's just a couple of more comments in the chat. Margaret states, as a person who has to scan everything, big no to scanning everything.
Yes.
And Kelly says, first suggestion, start small, like your desk drawer.
Yep. Yeah. And I would also say, if anyone is in the situation of, I've been in and I've experienced, I've moved into offices and there was a filing cabinet there from my predecessor, and I've been there in that office for years, never opening it. That's also a good place to start. If you have records that are just hanging around, or you don't, you know, the big question is, I don't know what's in there. Why do we have it? If you don't know what you have, starting with an inventory is a great place to start. Again, I think of it as from a standpoint of why do we have it and how are we using it? And if we don't know what we have and we don't know why we're keeping it or what the potential use is, then why do you even have it? And that's not to say go through and just throw things out. You do have to apply retention and disposition in a sort of legally sustainable way. But for me, that's where I've always started it, because I've been in attics and basements and storerooms and just chock full of boxes, and no one knows what's in them. And that to me represents a cost. It may not be apparent, it may not be a line item cost, but it's a cost. And by not addressing it, again, if any of you are close to retirement, maybe you can get out of here without having to think about your successor. But someone like myself that has 20 years or more, there is always that thought of, well, if I just punt it down the line, well, it's going to be someone else's problem. And what can I do today to alleviate that future headache? I do see this one question about in terms of I guess it's the new retention schedule, when do they become effective? They become effective when you adopt the retention schedule. The schedule is already effective as of August 1st, but if you are a local government entity or part of a local government, the schedule will become effective when you adopt that schedule. By default, it becomes effective January 1st. That's when the pre-existing schedules are no longer in force. So hopefully that answers your question. And I can do a demo of the search function. I kind of skipped over that for time purposes, but do you think that would be helpful for folks?
See, well, are there any, does anyone have questions? These can be questions specific, very specific to your library. Oh, I'm sorry, Dennis, I don't believe you touched upon COVID. Do you mind just like showing, I know that you had sent me an email with information relating to those, the health forms, that so many people are collecting.
Yes, and actually I'll use that to demonstrate the schedule online feature, because I think that'll be useful. I will also say that if you don't get my monthly newsletter, email me. I send out once a month. Actually, starting next year, we're going to have a combined regional advisor newsletter. So it won't be personalized by me, but we do send out information on about once a month. We try not to burden anyone on what's going on. And in the one I will be sending out next week for November, I will be touching on this very issue of these health surveys that we're all dealing with. So let me go to, I think this one.
Kelly, that's a great question. That's actually exactly what Dennis is going to be addressing right now, because I know there's a lot of questions regarding the staff and health visitor questions in retention.
So this is our website. If you've never been there before, please check it out. We have this section on managing records, which we're actually in the process of updating and revising. So if you have used it, or if you want to use it and provide some feedback as to what's missing, is it useful, is it helpful, is it confusing, funnel that to me, so we want to make this as strong a resource as possible. But we have this topic on retention and disposition. And if you scroll down, you have state agencies, which you can ignore. And then you have the section on local government disposition. This is where we have the model resolution form, as well as the list of major revisions if you want to check those out. And then we have the link to the new local government schedule. And it gives you a lot of good information as to the effective date. We have all these different versions. If you want the PDF version, if you want a hard copy version, we do have a limited supply. Email me, we can mail one out. But we're sort of promoting the electronic version. We have access databases and Excel worksheets if you want to get fancy. But we have this web, what we're calling the web resource. And it's basically this left-hand menu with the introduction information is actually very useful and important. It kind of gives you an overview of how to use the schedule and how to apply it. But then further down, we have the functional headings that I was talking about. And we have this very simple search box. And in terms of the COVID questionnaires, obviously the process of getting this through the regulatory process was put in motion right about when COVID hit. So we were not able to specifically address some of the records issues we're seeing. So we're coming up with some creative interpretation. And I know for the COVID questionnaires, we have as item in the public health section, it relates to screening programs. So that's why I searched for the word screening. And you can see all these different items that come up with that term. But I know that it's the one that we're using or we're interpreting for COVID is this miscellaneous item, results of screening programs, 792. Oh, I'll just point out, you can see here, the black diamond indicates there was a major revision. 790, and in this case, the screening program that we're using for COVID doesn't have that. 792 is the new number, and in the previous schedules, we list the previous numbers if that's helpful or necessary. The arrow expands, and what we're advising people to use is the 792E. It's not really what it was intended for, but it's the best fit in this circumstance, and so those have a 1-year retention. These are meant for essentially public health authorities who might do screening or testing programs, but we feel that certainly given the impact COVID has had on communities, particularly in your part of the state, the current questionnaires serve this function of screening individuals, particularly if, you know, I don't want to get all doom and gloom, although the weather might be appropriate, but if we're looking at a winter second wave, you know, having these questionnaires on file for a year, it's the best fit we have under the circumstances. They might, you know, 1 year might be a little excessive, but we definitely want to ensure that the records are not simply disposed immediately, just because we don't know where this public health emergency is going to take us in the next 3 to 6, 12 months. Hopefully nowhere bad, but again, we're sort of in the world of unknown. So that's hopefully gives you some sense of how the search function works. If you wanted to navigate to a specific section, we have this section or subsection hyperlinked. And again, that will then take you to all of the sort of, this happens to be, again, miscellaneous public health. For your purposes, you're probably more interested in the library and library system section, which sort of, again, has, you can see these are the 4 items that have been updated or included. The ones that don't have the previous item numbers, good indication that they were not in the previous schedules. So I can stop sharing that. Hopefully that oh, actually, I see the sort of a follow-up question in terms of the programs, and in terms of patrons who register, patrons who attend. If you public programs, if you're creating those records, it would be all, let's see what the program and exhibit file record says. Yes, yes, we have attendance sheets and registration forms when no fee is charged, and the retention for that is 0 after no longer needed. So if for your business purposes you want to keep them a month or 6 months or 1 week, we're basically saying you can dispose of them when you no longer need them. In terms of the template for policies and procedures, email me that and I can, or Jen, if you want, I can email it to you and you can disseminate it further. We do have a template. Okay, I'll make a note of that. We have a template. It's a very micro level policy. It's very detailed. It is geared, the way we have it structured, it's geared for towns, but I don't want that to put anyone off, because good records management, as far as I am concerned, is neutral, depending on, regardless of what type of organization you work for. So it does hit some of the best practices and areas of consideration. You can adapt it, obviously, to meet your specific needs, and I'm happy to be part of that conversation as well, if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Dennis. Are there any further questions? Yeah, Kelly states their thanks, and yeah, wow, that website is a tremendous resource. There's also a lot on there.
Don't be overwhelmed. That's probably the most common adjective I hear from people. Don't be overwhelmed. Again, you don't have to figure it all out. That's what we're here for at the State Archives. But yeah, again, if the website is there, my thing with the website is, yes, there's a lot on there. For my money, I'm not always convinced it's organized in the best way. So if you get confused or get lost, let me know. Any feedback is helpful for us to sort of make improvements.
You had mentioned physically going to people's workplaces. Yep. Is there any sort of consideration for when that will begin again?
I have no idea. I hesitate to speculate, because I have been told on more than one occasion not to speculate. Mm-hmm. But some of that has to do, obviously, with public health concerns, but it also has to do with fiscal concerns, and we're just not sure where any of that is going right now.
Sure, definitely.
You know, which is regrettable, because that was the part of my job that I enjoyed the most, was getting out and actually seeing what you're dealing with. And again, with these types of technologies, we can sort of we have a little bit more flexibility, but it's not always the same. Particularly if you have those rooms full of records and you're like, we don't know what to do with this. That's where getting me on site is helpful. But what I would say this, correction, I can't say if you want, but if you need me to be on site, ask. Because what I've been told is we need the demand to be driven by you folks, so that we can argue up the chain that there is this demand, there is this need, and that it needs to happen now. That's sort of the catchphrase of what is the immediate need for an on-site visit in order for that to be approved. So, but if you're not asking for it, then I can't sort of beat up the people above me saying they're asking, there's demand. So yeah.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions? I know that we're quickly closing in on that 11:30 hour. This recording will be posted once again. I had stated it earlier, but it will be posted to the RCLS YouTube channel. I will be sending out a follow-up email that will not only have the link to this recording, but also an online evaluation form. If you don't mind filling that out, it takes about 5 to 10 minutes to complete. I'll be sending that out on Monday is my intention. I'll give it one more minute for any further questions. Dennis, did you have anything to add before we close?
No, I look forward to working with all of you. Again, it's I would say public libraries are a constituency that sometimes falls through the cracks through, I think, no fault of anyone. I'm one person for 11 counties. So I won't necessarily be sitting around going, gee, I wonder how the libraries in, you know, Ramapo are doing. So don't be shy about reaching out and reminding me and say, hey, you said you'd help us, because that is my job. But you guys have to kind of take the first step, because I can't, you know, I do try to follow up here and there, but again, in sort of my duties of trying to service 11 counties,
Sure.
it sometimes counts. Yeah. And again, libraries are, you know, towns and villages probably get the most attention just because we know who the town and village clerks are. I don't know who your records management officer is. It becomes harder for me to then sort of, you know, reach out and be proactive. So again,
Sure.
Don't be shy and make your voice heard, because again, we're here to serve you. I would also say, keep in mind, as libraries, we do, whether it's additional training, we do hope to offer a grant program for local governments next year. We offer that every year, I think it's fair to say, for the last 20 or 30 years. So again, if you have a project or a program related to records management that you want to advance, let's talk about what that might look like and whether or not it would meet our sort of grant guidelines and what that might look like. I wouldn't necessarily just wait around for grants, because they're in some respects very competitive, but there is some limited funding available.
Yeah, thank you. Sam just had a follow-up question regarding which document you were looking at when answering the question about program retention.
Oh, yeah, that was the retention schedule. Actually, I'll put that link in the chat as well. And I just went to, actually, you know what? I'll do it again. I'll share my screen just so that everyone. So this is the main LGS1 schedule, and I suppose I could search for it, but because the search is a very simple search, sometimes it returns a lot of results. So you just don't want to search for program. You'll get hundreds. But I know, since we're talking about libraries, I know there's a section for library and library system records. And I knew that we added this program and exhibit file. Again, you know, it's a major revision because of the Black Diamond. The item is 603. And because there's nothing in the previous schedule numbers, you know, it's a new item, so I can expand that. And there's this description that it, you know, what the records generally might consist of. And we have this sub item B, so it'd be 603B, which is attendance sheets and registration forms when no fee is charged, and that's 0 after no longer needed. I realize we don't specify when a fee is charged, but I'm also presuming that when it comes to libraries, most, if not all, of your programming is free. At least in my experience, that's how it operates. If there is a fee charge, it's probably one of these fiscal items because there's money exchanged. But so basically 0 after no longer needed is interpreted to mean it's up to you to decide how long does that value of those records last. Is it as soon as the program is done, you never look back on it, you never need to refer to it? Is it you keep it for a month just in case there's ever a question? Or is there some other, in terms of attendance or registration forms, do you ever need to prove that someone was aware that they actually attended the program? I don't know. I can't conceive of where you would need that for more than a very short period of time. But again, if you have questions or want to develop a specific, and this is where an office retention schedule would come into play, because you could, extract this from this larger document, put it into your own document or spreadsheet, and then rather than 0 after no longer needed, you could set a specific period, 30 days, 1 week, 6 months, whatever makes sense for your business needs. But then you have that decision documented so that the next time or the next person that is involved with these records knows what the agreed upon procedure and policy is. So that's actually a really great question, and thanks for letting me talk more about it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, I guess with that, if anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to Dennis. I'll be sending an email that also includes his contact information, but I know that you had already placed it in the chat as well, so it is there. Thank you so much. This was equal parts fantastic and overwhelming, but I am glad that you are available to assist. It's so appreciated. It is.
My pleasure. Anything I can do to help you guys out, just let me know.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for attending. I will be in touch. Thank you, Dennis. That was just incredible. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good one.
All right. Take care, everyone.